Hello, and welcome to the Multilingual World podcast. If, like me, you're fascinated by language and languages, you've probably asked yourself questions like, how multilingual is the world? Where are the world estimated 7,000 languages spoken, and which countries have the lion's share? How is this wealth of linguistic diversity managed by individuals, groups, and governmental authorities through language policies, and what are the consequences of such choices? Why do people stop speaking and transmitting their heritage languages and shift to dominant languages? What can we do to stop the 60 to 90% of the world's languages from disappearing? To explore these questions and many more, I will be interviewing influential academics and multilingual speakers living in Manchester to discuss aspects of multilingualism in different parts of the world, dispel the myths of inferior and primitive languages, and most importantly, we will discuss how language science contributes to improving access to better education and health, and how central it is to socioeconomic development and to fight social inequalities. I'm Dr. Serge Sagna. I'm a lecturer in linguistics at the University of Manchester, and I'm very excited to welcome you to the Multilingual World podcast. Welcome back to the Multilingual World podcast. And today I have a special guest from SOAS, University of London. And I'm happy to introduce Professor Julia Sallabank, who's a professor of language policy and revitalization. So first, how are things going on at SOAS? SOAS is
busy as ever. Thank you.
I think I told you before, right? SOAS is a special place for me because I'm an alumnus of SOAS.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm happy to have you on our podcast.
Okay.
So Julia, you've been working on language revitalization. And as part of your work, you have been running trainings and workshops in different places, including Thailand and India. And you've worked with language communities, around the world in places like New Zealand, Cook Islands, New Caledonia, and in the British Isles. So precisely where did you work if we want to come back to the British Isles? Where did you work? Where did you do work?
Yeah, specific saying British Isles because they are the small islands around the British Isles, particularly Guernsey, which is where part of my family come from, but also Jersey and the Isle of Man, which is between Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales, almost like in the middle.
So what is the language situation there? I think we're talking about minority and endangered languages here, right?
Very much, yeah. So the Isle of Man, the language is a Celtic language, and it's in principle on a continuum between the Scottish Islands and Northern Ireland, but the continuum is broken more or less at the Northern Ireland end because that region has lost its language. And the Manx language, the last official native speaker died in 1974. So this is really a revival situation. They were down to a very, very low ebb. But now they've got maybe about 1,500 people that claim to speak some Manx, and I think maybe about 500 are quite fluent.
Okay, so they use it on a daily basis.
Some people do, yes. Some people told me that, basically they live all their lives through Manx, and, all their friends speak Manx, yeah.
So at the family level, the social circles, do they use them in other areas like school?
Yeah, there is a whole junior school that does everything through the medium of Manx. They've got about 70, 80 students now, and they have a couple of classes, a couple of subjects at a local secondary school, which are also taught all through Manx as well. I think history, IT.
Okay. So one other, point is that you are from the British Isles. Am I right to think that? And your heritage language is Guernsey.
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Pretty good, yeah, better than most people.
Yeah. And why is it your heritage language? Why do you call it your heritage language?
it wasn't actually spoken in my family, but it's the language of Guernsey, which is where my mother's family come from and where my father grew up. And it's always something that's been there in the background. For example, hearing little bits, I think, when I was at Sunday school picnics, for example, when I was young. And I've always been fascinated with it and always wanted to be able to speak it. And so when I wanted to do a PhD, I thought I'm going to come back to this and study it. Yeah.
But you didn't learn it as a child at home. You
No,
didn't.
only, well, it's interesting. I think I heard some, because when I then learned French at school, it seemed kind of familiar and I knew things that I hadn't been taught, because it is related to French.
So it's related to French.
Mm.
You spoke English at home.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you learned French in school.
Yes, yes.
And Guernsey was around.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, well, we used to go to Guernsey every year for holidays, stay with my mum's family. Yeah.
Okay. So, and that probably what led to your interest on endangered languages.
Yes,
right?
you know, I didn't even know about the whole phenomenon of endangered languages. And that was also true of other people in Guernsey as well. So when I started talking to people in Guernsey, they didn't know that there were other endangered languages in the world. And they thought they were going through this whole kind of trauma of language loss on their own. And they were really quite surprised and almost quite emotional to hear that there were things like the Endangered Language Documentation Program that, you know, and someone had given something like £20 million to save endangered languages.
So when linguists talk about endangered languages, what are they talking about? Because usually we hear, you know, about endangered species, you know, the loss of biodiversity, but really less about endangered languages. What do we talk about as linguists when we talk about endangered languages?
Right. Well, really, a language is endangered. There are several ways of measuring it, but the most common one is by what we call intergenerational transmission, whether it's used by children, mostly in the family. So a language is really endangered when it's not spoken by children, and particularly not by the parental, the childbearing generation. Often it's then just spoken by grandparents. And you get to a situation where the grandparents speak one language. Sometimes the parents are bilingual, or what we call they have a passive ability. They can understand the heritage language, but they don't speak it. And often the children don't speak it at all. And then they end up in a situation where the children can't speak to their grandparents.
So we have a situation where there's no intergenerational transmission between you know, grandparents or parents and their children.
Yeah. And linguists reckon that this might be the case. I mean, the linguists reckon that there are about 7,000 languages in the world, and possibly at least 50%, possibly even up to 90% may be in this situation.
Yeah, so they may be endangered and about threatened with extinction in the coming decades.
Yes. And linguists feel this is really important for the sum of human knowledge, but also I think it's important for people's own state of mind, people's own well-being.
I mean, I think it makes sense. I mean, we were talking about it in a previous podcast where we were saying that, you know, no people have the monopole of, you know, human experience, of human knowledge. So wherever people have, like, you know, lived, they have adapted the environment, they have learned to produce medical knowledge, you know, and have adapted the environment for their own survival. So it does make a lot of sense. And you know, and you also worked, you know, on language attitude.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
So what is it? What exactly do you do when you work on language attitude? Why is it important?
Okay, it's really important because you have to think about the reasons why people are giving up minority languages. We talk about minoritized languages rather than perhaps minorities, because you can actually have quite a large number of people speaking a language, but they are minoritized in that they are maybe marginalized. They don't have a kind of big economic impact in society. They may be discriminated against. There may be language policies which prevent them from speaking their home languages, or it's simply not taught in schools. It's not seen as an important language, and this is the case with a lot of languages in the UK nowadays too. I think we're going to come back to that later. So people end up believing that their language is not as good as other languages. Even my own mother said that basic Genesee was holding us back, and therefore we had to give it up in order to speak English properly and get on in economics. Because when people think about their priorities, they tend to think about, getting a job, getting their children educated, being able to have a decent life. And too many people think that they have to give up their home languages in order to do that.
So they look at the utility of the language rather than other aspects,
And also they forget that they can actually add rather than replace. They can. It's normal for humans to be bilingual. We have an infinite number of languages that we can incorporate in our heads. There are people who speak 20, 40 languages, and regularly, you'll know, in Africa, in China, for example, in India, people regularly speak 4, 6 languages on a daily basis to different people in their lives. So it's perfectly possible to add a major language, if you like, an educational language, economic language, a utilitarian language to your repertoire, and carry on, not lose the important parts of your heritage that are connected with your heritage language.
Yeah, I think the situation in Africa is often, I mean, in my part of Africa at least, is that people feel like they need to help their children early by teaching them in Francophone Africa, especially. By transmitting French to them instead of, starting with their languages and then moving on to French in school, for example.
Yeah.
And as you said, most of those people are actually multilingual.
Yeah.
But they feel that, they have to transmit just one language to their children.
Yeah. There's one thing, there's a monolingual mindset it's kind of like put out, kind of promoted by countries like Britain and France. But there's also kind of hierarchy in multilingualism. So if you say, oh, I speak French and German and Italian, oh, how wonderful, aren't you clever? But if you say, I speak Wolof and or Somali or Hindi, people say, oh, well, that's not very useful here, is it? Yeah. And too many people that I've talked to, they suffered for speaking their home languages at school. I talked to people who were told, oh, go home and come back when you can speak English.
There's stigma attached to those,
and bullied and everything. And so often, for the best reasons, they wanted to spare their children that pain, and so they just taught them the educational language when they were young.
But I think now more and more people actually realize that it is possible to maintain your heritage language and, add, the, let's say, international language or the schooling language, medium of instruction, later. And, it leads us to the issue of language maintenance, right?
Yeah.
And there are different efforts, there are efforts around, I mean, I can talk about Manchester because I had a guest, Leonie Geiser, who was, doing research in, on language maintenance in Manchester. And I think you have been also involved, on language maintenance efforts, right? Yeah. Can you tell us about it?
I've been involved more with language revitalization, but it's important, to realize when a language is endangered, and people don't often always realize until it's too late because they don't really want to know. I remember talking to a lady from South Africa, and she was talking about, like we've been talking, that people are increasingly speaking English with their kids. Because it's seen as more useful for school, etc. And I thought, alarm bells ring. That means their home language might be on the way out. And they said, "How dare you say our language is endangered?" As if it was an insult, So I think sometimes people really don't want to know, and also it's kind of maybe strange, but people don't always associate the fact that they're not speaking their language with their children with the fact that the language might be dying out. Because often in many societies also, it's not just the role of the parents to pass on the language, it's the whole society or peer. But you get children speaking languages with each other, and they learn from each other, they learn from the whole community. So yeah, I mean, it's again a kind of Western view that it's just in the family. It's often the whole community that needs to maintain a language.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
I also think that, people don't see the pattern,
yeah.
of the interruption of transmission within, the community. They don't see it happen. And if they use the language between, them, like their friends and their family, their social circles, they probably think, oh, it's very much alive. What they don't see is how it's going to the next generation. How the transmission is interrupted in the next generation. But I think it's important. I mean, we've mentioned language attitude. So people's attitude towards languages, can lead to interrupting the transmission.
Yeah. So
Either
often
because they think they're not useful.
Yeah, and often what you get, I've seen this many times, you get parents will try to speak the language to the children, and the children will just reply in English.
I have that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have that. So I insist, I keep speaking my language.
Yeah, it's
transmitting a language alone in a foreign country, with in a different environment, it requires some
you need to find a network of people to speak it with, things to do in the language.
It's hard in England. I'm alone.
Have you not got any online friends or?
Well, I mean, online interaction, obviously, if you're talking to people back home, but the socialization online is different from the daily socialization, right?
You're gonna have to take them for a visit.
I think so.
And people do. People send their kids back home for for several months, maybe for the summer.
Yeah. That's a solution, which is not a cheap one, but it is one. So okay, so we try and maintain languages, but you mentioned earlier minoritized languages and minority languages. And in the case of minority languages, minoritized languages, languages that sometimes don't have official status. Or like are discriminated, but they still have like a large number of speakers. And they're not necessarily endangered. Or they are like, vital in a different place, but spoken, like Arabic in Manchester. You can talk about maintaining Arabic. And because it's not endangered, you wouldn't talk about revitalizing it, right? I'm just going into terms that linguists use, general public.
So it's interesting. Arabic is in a funny position in the UK because obviously it's a major world language and very important, and is it's a language of the United Nations, for example, but it's still seen as low status in the UK, even though you can learn it in schools, some schools, not many schools, because of again this view of what's an important language, what's a useful language to learn. But actually Arabic is really useful to learn.
Could give like Wolof or Yoruba, Igbo.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
So you froze for a bit there.
Oh right, okay. I was saying that you could give like examples like Yoruba, Igbo, Swahili.
I have well, I have students from Igbo and Yoruba backgrounds, at SOAS who are trying to maintain their languages or try to relearn it. Like a student at the moment who, again, didn't learn his heritage language as a child, and this is increasingly common that people from the next generation are realizing what they've lost and wanting to learn their heritage languages.
I have actually cases like that where people ask me to write. I mean, people think they can learn it from a dictionary. So I often get asked, is your dictionary, ready? So you won't learn the language from the dictionary.
People talk about, words are bricks and you have to put them together with cement and they have to be in a certain pattern in order for the wall to stand up.
So in those cases, we can talk about maintenance, right? But the work that you have been doing was on, endangered languages and language revitalization. So let's talk a little bit about endangered languages. Just to ask first, how do languages die? I mean, we talked about it a little bit.
It is a lot to do with attitudes and I mean sometimes it's more overt oppression but very often it's more subtle processes. I think this is what's happening with the majority of endangered languages in the world.
So it's often, I mean, with like in the literature, you often see terms like sudden death, where, you know, let's say a population is wiped out in an extreme situation. That's quite extreme, right? We don't have it often. But the usual case is, as you said, a subtle and long process. In which people don't realize what's going on, that the language is actually being.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And so what is the current research in, you know, on language endangerment worldwide? Can you briefly talk about it?
Okay, there are several strands. What linguists tend to do is what we call language documentation. So recording and videoing languages and trying to analyze them, so that for the future, then they are kind of, if you like, in a box and can be taken out and revived. And this is what happened in the Isle of Man. They made recordings in the 1940s, particularly, which were very useful for the language revitalizers, you know, 50 years later. It's also, there's also a program in America called the Breath of Life program, where universities, like my own university, has a lot of archives of languages of the world. And people from various minority groups, or particularly Native American groups, are welcomed to the universities. They have these summer programs where they teach them to use the archives, to access them, and to analyze the languages, and to use those records to relearn the languages. So that's kind of pretty extreme case where the language has been lost. But what I do is what we call more sociolinguistic research. I'm looking at the relationship between language and society and all these things like language attitudes. And I'm particularly interested in what people are actually doing all around the world to try and revive and maintain their languages.
Talking about archive, there's an archive at SOAS, where you are, right? Your university.
Yeah, well, we are a national archive, particularly for various records. But the Endangered Language Archive has actually moved to Berlin now.
Oh yes, of course. I forget that. So when a language dies, what is lost, you know, and why should people care? Because that's a question that often comes, right? You know, like often you hear we should maybe speak one language, you know, and you know, all the world's problem will be solved, right? And then the question comes about which one, you know, and some will tell you, well, English. Others will say, why don't we use Esperanto? It's neutral. And obviously from the French side, they will tell you absolutely not. You know, French is such a beautiful language that no one, you know, should leave it behind. The question here is, why should people care about endangered languages?
I think both of those ideas are related to the same idea, that the way that we think is very strongly related to the languages that we speak. I personally don't believe in that really strong link personally, because, for example, if you believe that one world language will bring world peace, then you only have to look at civil wars to, you know, things like Rwanda, one of the few monolingual countries in Africa, and very nasty civil war. You know, it doesn't work speaking the same language. It's not going to necessarily make you understand each other better. So, I mean, really, more importantly, would be to learn to understand each other at a deeper level in terms of culture, for example, and to be more tolerant. And I think learning languages and learning about other people's cultures is one way to make you more tolerant and to understand people. And that is more likely, I think, to bring greater understanding between peoples. Linguists also talk about, as I mentioned before, the kind of knowledge about how the brain works, which will be lost. For example, you know, there are some languages that have very, very few consonants, other languages that have very, very few vowels, and you never would imagine if the guy who used to be in the next door office to me hadn't recorded one of those languages, that we would never have known it was possible to speak in that way. Yeah, but for me, it's more to do with kind of like a sense of pride, a sense of empowerment. I think, you know, when you ban a language, when you tell people that their language isn't useful, isn't important, then you kind of like you're putting down their whole culture and well, you know, and the people themselves, right? And it's also, at the moment, it's one of the few ways you're so allowed to discriminate against people. So often it's actually standing for racism. When people say, "Oh, we know that's funny language," they're actually saying, "Oh, we don't want you here," you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, the other thing is that, you know, a heritage language is like, you know, a language of part of your identity, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's basically, you know, suppressing one language is also suppressing, you know, part of
Yeah.
someone's identity,
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
right?
Again, that's a slightly tricky one to say, because again, I don't. Yeah, you have to be careful, because people still have identity once they've shifted languages, you know,
Yes,
and people say, "Oh, we no, we won't be able to talk about this. We won't be able to talk about traditional medicine, for example, or traditional crafts." And actually, it is possible to translate a lot of that stuff,
but
and it might not have.
the reason why I'm saying
Yeah, yeah,
part of that identity is
yeah,
that it's not like one. You
yeah,
don't expect someone to have just one identity. We have multiple
yeah.
identities.
Absolutely, yes, yes, yes.
So that portion,
Mm,
you know,
mm,
of, you know, the person identity, the
mm,
person's,
mm.
you know, self is probably, you know, I suppose lost. I mean, so I guess you can express it in a different way, but
I think
yeah,
people who don't speak well, and have a heritage language, don't really understand this. Um, I you know, I didn't when I was young, and I've always been interested in languages, um, but I didn't realize really what it meant to have a heritage language until I started to relearn it. And I got in touch with people and got to know people, made friends with people, and started speaking the language to certain people as our primary means of communication. And it's really you know, it's added to my identity, it's added to my sense of self in a way that I hadn't really realized before I started to do that.
yeah. But I mean, the other thing that you said is the environmental
Yeah,
knowledge, right?
yeah,
That
yeah,
is lost, and we
yeah,
talked about it earlier,
yeah,
right? So when you lose a language, you also lose, you know, that knowledge that has been accumulated,
yes,
you know, through
yes,
that
yeah,
knowledge over, you know, centuries.
yeah,
So in that, like from that, you know, point of view, it's hard to, you could translate, let's say you know, some terms from, let's
yeah.
say, English to Jola Egima, let's say. But, you know, the categorization, you know, system, the knowledge that people have of the, let's say, the agricultural system of rice farming, you know, how they practice it, is never going to be exactly the same,
Yeah,
even after translation. I don't see myself, for example, translating some agricultural terms to Wolof and thinking they're fine. It just doesn't
yeah,
work, right?
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah, I think the nuances are lost, you know.
there are a lot of
Yes,
nuances.
yes, and also actually often, you know, knowledge about various environmental systems, they often like encapsulated in the way people and in the way the language has categorized those, and you know, and you know, you find botanists or biologists finding, oh, okay, these people actually do understand much more than we realized about how certain species are linked
Of
because
course.
they describe them in that way, and it's encoded
We've
through
been
the language.
interacting with them for centuries, so they
Yeah,
know how to
exactly. Yes,
handle, you
yes,
know,
yes.
those things. But in general, I think when we talk about the importance of biodiversity, you know, for the planet, I think it's also important to emphasize, you know, on the fact that, you know, linguistic diversity, you know, is also important for the survival of the species, of the human species, if you
Yeah, and cultural
will.
diversity too. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So what do you do to support communities? You know, what do linguists do to support communities that, are trying to either maintain their languages or, revitalize them or even reclaim them, right? Because these are three different, stages.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So let's go through, one by one.
Oh, okay. I think one of the really important things we do is raise awareness. I'm not the only person who's visited a community and started talking to people about language. Simply asking, I don't go wade in and say, why don't you speak your language with your children? They go, oh, that's the way to put their backs up. But I talk to people about their experiences with language, about which languages they speak, and often they haven't really thought about this kind of thing before because, most people are not interested in language per se. They only use language to do things. And so I've talked to people in New Caledonia, for example, who was like, oh, we never actually thought about this before. And the fact that, we two parents come from different language backgrounds, but we speak French together, and we haven't taught our children our home languages. And they never really, even though they were quite committed, if you like, to saving their languages, they hadn't really thought about how it affected their own lives. And I've had people, if I just doing an attitude survey, people have turned around at the end and said, oh, thank you for doing something to save our language. And I thought I was just doing attitude survey. But it just made people think about it. And I think that's the first step. I mean, it's important to raise awareness. Like I said earlier about, the fact that actually, a language might slip away without you noticing if you don't use it with your kids. And yeah.
I mean, I think this is a good point because I've been running a radio program in Senegal, in my community for a few years now, and the idea is to raise awareness, on the endangerment, on language transmission, and on endangered aspect of the language and the culture. And often I hear friends, I talk to friends and say, "Oh yeah, I think the language with people like you, I think the language will be saved." I'm like, no, come on.
No, it's got to be you. Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely, linguists can't do it. I mean, many linguists have this sort of savior, or some linguists, let's say, sort of savior aspect. We're going to wade in and save your language. But actually, it's only the community that can save the language. All we can do is help by, for example, making recordings. By some linguists have training in what we call applied linguistics, that is creating language teaching materials. We can help make dictionaries, like you said earlier, and other teaching tools. And we can share that information with the community. We also have access to money. We can help people to apply for grants. For example, to create materials to learn and to teach the language, reference materials, and I think most crucially, we have access to the academic literature, and we know what's going on in the rest of the world. So we can say, oh well, I heard of another community who are trying to do this, that, the other, to save their language. Why don't you try this? Yeah. Because people in isolated communities, even not so isolated like Guernsey, as I said, didn't really know what was going on in other parts of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I have, let's say, the advantage, or the privilege of being a member of the linguists community and a member of the speakers community, trying to do work to, raise awareness and basically try and lead kind of language revitalization, program, which, the radio is part of it. And I produce a numeracy booklet with one of my colleagues, Virve Veeman from Tartu, University of Tartu.
Oh.
Just to try and help children to learn, basic numeracy skills, in their own language before being forced to learn French, because that's what's happening, right? Children are forced to learn in French.
Yes.
In school.
And they don't learn their historical numeral system either, for example.
No, the numeral system is disappearing among children. So once my niece, my cousin, actually, she's small, but she's my cousin. So once I asked her to count up to 10, in my language, she could not. She went 1, 2, 3, up to 4 or 5, she shifted to French.
Yeah.
So what we're doing is basically they speak the language well, but the numeracy system itself is disappearing.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a challenge, right, at every level. So once you produce a booklet, for example, people are happy to have a booklet with them, but you know, the worry is that it becomes like that thing that they're holding, that the language is written,
yes,
but the effort, you know, the real work is not really in that book or on that book. The real work is really speaking the language.
Absolutely.
The only way you can save the language is really by, you know, by transmitting
Yes, the
it.
most important thing, just speak your language, and particularly when it's at this stage of, you know, not totally lost, it's the maintenance stage. That's the best thing to do, is just speak the language, use it with whoever you can, try to, you know, make it your first choice, your default language, if you like, when talking to friends and family. Yes, the socialization. Yeah.
But I think that's something you have to remind people all the time. You know, if you don't teach the language won't teach itself to the children.
And think of, you know, it may have to like actually work at opportunities to use it. People in the Isle of Man, for example, go for walks in their language, have a walking club. They have a football club where they play and they use Manx actually. And this happens also in America. Some of the students in American universities, they learn Native American languages, and they can use that in the football game, so the other team can't understand them.
Oh, right. So it's almost like they use it as a secret, like, you know, language so they find a context of use, a domain of use that they basically continue the language. That's a very good idea. So I mean, again, what do linguists do to support communities? You know,
we gather information.
Material. That's what we were talking about it, right? Radio programs, for example, we need the radio program. You know, we produce material like dictionaries and
I think we can act as conduits and sources of information. We're very good at collecting information, at categorizing it, putting it into boxes. We need to open up those boxes and share it back with communities.
And I mean, this work is also done in the context of, like, you know, language rights, right?
Yes.
So can you like elaborate on this?
As you mentioned earlier, you know, many languages are not allowed to be used in schools. They're not recognized, for example, in the court system. If you had the misfortune to be arrested, for example, you know, can you use your language in the court? Would an interpreter be provided, or would you be expected to use the majority language? And you know, often we know that minorities are you know, kind of they are more highly represented in the prison system than you would expect from the numbers. So you know, that and sometimes we know that they haven't understood what's going on. There's a linguist called Anita Pavlenko who's looked at that, for example, a lot. You know, heavy hundreds to the caution, for example. You know, and so on and so forth. Education is really important, because in many parts of the world, kids go to school in a language they don't understand. So how on earth can they going to learn? And you know, it's important for humanity, because you may be missing out on the next Einstein there. You know.
So in the case of languages in courts, for example, you know, one of the cases is where if, for example, you were on a trial, you know, and you know, like, you don't have an interpreter, for example, or you're given the wrong interpreter. So let's take the case of Arabic. You know, you could say, okay, like, you know, this person is from Tunisia, let's say. And you bring a Syrian, you know, interpreter who is also Arabic speaking, right? The question is, do they understand each other? And you know, often
it's
you know,
a very
there are quite big, exactly. The differences are quite broad. So it's important actually in the choice of interpreter. And the other thing that we talked about in a different podcast is hospitals.
Yes.
So
What
if
happens often in doctors' surgeries is you get kids having to translate for their parents, with
kids having to
doctors,
translate for their parents, and if you don't have kids and you turn up in a hospital, you need, urgent medical attention.
and you can't explain what's wrong
You
with you.
can't
But
explain
also,
what's wrong with you.
and also, it's not always appropriate for children to have to do that.
That's the other thing. So there are so many issues that lead linguists to remind people that actually, language.
Because it's I think language rights are often like predicated on the right to speak your language, and and there are different levels of linguistic rights.
Yes.
But a lot of people would agree that it's okay fine to use your language at home. Some people would say, oh, but don't impose it on us, as if the majority language wasn't imposed already.
Exactly.
But the Global Coalition for Language Rights is saying basically you should have the right to speak however you want, whenever you want,
and wherever you want.
Yes, and why not? I myself have been told off for speaking my language in the pub.
Seriously?
Why not?
In the UK?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Wow. For speaking Guernsey?
Yes, I had a visitor in my local pub, and we were chatting away, and then the next time I went to the pub, one of my neighbours came up to say, "You should speak English in the pub."
How did you
Why
react?
do you want to hear what I'm saying anyway?
It's none of your business.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just my last question here is on a project you're involved in, and that's an EU project on language revitalization, right? So, and you had a meeting last week, I think, in Vienna.
Yes, that was our kickoff meeting. It's a 3-year project, and this is actually focusing on languages of Europe. And there are, I think, about 6 partners, and one of them is the University of Tartu that you mentioned earlier, actually. Yeah, in Estonia. Yeah. There's a professor called Christine Kutma, who is a UNESCO chair of something rather cultural diversity or something. So the University of Vienna is the lead partner, and what we're going to be looking at, I'm in what we call a work package, a subsection on what we call linguistic ecosystems. So looking at how languages are used in what contexts, not just the linguistic context, but also the social context for using languages. Because I think that the languages partly become endangered when the linguistic ecosystem kind of is imbalanced, out of balance, out of kilter, and unhealthy for certain languages or certain people. Yeah.
So the ecosystem, what do you include in the ecosystem?
So the other languages that's spoken in the community, but also what language is spoken in this Fishman's kind of sort of what language is spoken by whom, where, when, and why, but also what language is important for what purpose, and the status of the languages, and there's political aspects, the language rights, all of those things come into it, the language policies. Yeah. So Christine from Tartu is looking particularly at language policies. Okay. And we've chosen, I think, 6 languages as examples of different kinds of language status or language situations around Europe as exemplars. So, and Cornish is one of them in the UK, a language which pretty much died out a couple of centuries ago and is now again undergoing revival, like the Isle of Man.
So it's been revived.
Yeah. Yes.
So it died out and it didn't have a speaker at all.
Yeah.
And then it was revived back. How many speakers are there today? Do you know?
Maybe 400 or 500, or I think they're more claim. It depends what you speak. I mean, what is a speaker is a big question. How good do you have to be? Do you have to be a native speaker? Can you be a second language speaker, a heritage language speaker? So there's lots of questions about that. There's a language called Seto in Estonia, is Russian-Estonian border that I hadn't heard of before. A language called Burgenland Croatian, which is a variety of Croatian spoken in southeast Austria. A language called Aranese, which is kind of northern Spain, Spanish-French border, Italian border too, I think. So several examples that we've got. Aromanian in Romania, Bulgaria, And these are all representative of different kind of situations that languages find themselves in. Often they're cross-border languages, as you know, from Africa as well. Often, and there are also different levels of what we call language vitality. So some are still spoken by all. So Bugalang Croatian is still spoken by young people, but as I mentioned, Cornish, you know, is not really spoken by anyone. There are neo-native speakers of Cornish, by the way. You know, people.
Say it again.
Neo-native speakers, so people whose parents decided that they were going to learn the language and speak it with their children.
Okay, so that's what linguists call neo-native speakers. New native speakers of the language.
Yes.
Not the traditional ones who inherited it from like granddad, great-granddad up to them.
So trying to restart that, yes. I mean, that's seen as the gold standard of language revitalization. But I think, you know, that's a big ask for people to do, and first of all, you've got to actually start to speak the language as well as you can, as much as you can, to the extent that you can, and have that desire to reclaim your language.
But that's a movement that's going on around the world, right? In different places, people are seeing the importance of getting the languages back, sometimes after they're completely lost.
Yes, exactly. Many places around the world, particularly in Australia and Native America as well. That's where they lost. Well, in Australia they call them sleeping languages. They don't like this term language death, which is far too final. Yeah.
I had this discussion with Gabriela Perez Baez, actually. You know.
Yeah.
And one of the reason why you can reclaim a language like that is you know, when you already have documentation available.
Yes.
You know, if everyone goes and you have you don't have anyone who speaks it anymore, then it's more difficult to reclaim the language, right?
Yeah, what's happened with Cornish is they had some written resources. Obviously, when it died out, there wasn't any recording, but they've used resources from Welsh and Breton because Cornish is between those two. So you can imagine that they would have been linguistically on what we call that linguistic continuum, and they've used both linguistic resources, but also you know, Welsh is also is also being revitalized. And they've got a lot of expertise in language revitalization that other groups can learn from.
So that's how they revived Cornish. Okay, that was my last question. Do you have something else that you wanted to talk about that I didn't mention?
Yeah, just briefly, you know, you mentioned this is a whole movement around the world, and increasingly communities, indigenous people are talking more and more about the importance of language for empowerment. It's turning around the idea that it's useless, it's our heritage language is holding us back. And so actually it's not, it can help us, it can help take us forwards, because it's a solid foundation that we can use, and we can reclaim our language in order to reclaim our pride and our identity. And this is increasingly important. And the United Nations has recognized this and has made this decade the decade of indigenous languages.
2022 to 2032.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Serge, for inviting me. It's lovely to see you again.
Yes, thank you for coming back. I had you here in Manchester for another event, and it was really good. And so thank you again for coming back, and hopefully see you soon for another discussion on the multilingual world.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye.
Before we go, remember that there is no education without language. There is no socioeconomic development without language. There is no meaningful political stability without good language management. Remember also that children and adults can function perfectly with multiple languages. So be a proud multilingual. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on our social media platforms, and see you very soon for another episode on the Multilingual World Podcast.